The changing room at Naval Air Station Oceana smelled like sweat and disinfectant, the kind of sterile aggression that permeated every corner of military life. Lieutenant Commander Kira Volkov stood motionless as three junior officers blocked the doorway, their laughter echoing off the metal lockers like rounds in a firing range. They didn't know her. They saw the streaks of gray in her dark hair, the lines around her eyes, the way she moved with deliberate economy rather than the brash confidence of youth. They saw a woman in her early 40s trying to muscle into a world that belonged to the young and the loud. What they didn't see was the scar tissue across her knuckles, the perfect posture that came from 2 decades of silent insertions into hostile territory, or the way her eyes tracked exits and threats with mechanical precision. One of them, a cocky lieutenant with a buzz cut and a face that had never seen real combat, stepped closer. His breath reeked of energy drinks and entitlement. "You lost, ma'am. The logistics office is 2 buildings over." His buddies snickered. Kira's expression didn't change. She'd been here before in 100 different forms in a dozen different countries. The changing room was just another confined space, and these weren't enemies. They were children playing dress-up in their father's uniforms. But when the lieutenant reached out to grab her shoulder, something shifted in the air. Her hand moved before his brain registered the threat. One moment he was smirking, the next he was on his knees, his wrist locked in a grip that sent white-hot pain shooting up his arm. The other two froze. Kira leaned down, her voice barely above a whisper, each word dropping like spent brass casings on concrete. "Touch me again and they'll be scraping your face off this floor." She released him and turned back to her locker as if nothing had happened. The three officers scrambled out, their bravado evaporating like steam. What they didn't know, what nobody at Oceana knew, was that Kira Volkov had spent 20 years in the shadows. Not as a pilot, as something else entirely. Something the Navy didn't advertise in recruitment videos. Her call sign had been Phantom. Not because she flew, she'd only started that after leaving the SEALs, but because of the way she disappeared into darkness and emerged with targets eliminated, intelligence extracted, missions completed that never made the news. Now she was here, transitioning into naval aviation, trying to prove herself all over again in a cockpit instead of behind enemy lines. The Admiralty thought it was a publicity stunt, a way to showcase career flexibility. They had no idea what she was capable of, and neither did the arrogant children who just learned their first lesson. Kira pulled on her flight suit, zipped it with practiced efficiency, and grabbed her helmet. Outside, the roar of FA-18 Super Hornets shook the tarmac. The sky was waiting. She walked toward the flight line alone, shoulders squared, stride measured. Behind her, the three officers were already spreading the story, their voices hushed and uncertain. They didn't use her name. They didn't know it yet, but they would. Everyone would. Because Phantom was about to become the most dangerous pilot the Navy had ever underestimated. The briefing room was packed with aviators, 32 men and women sitting in uncomfortable metal chairs beneath fluorescent lights that hummed like dying insects. Commander Jackson Hayes stood at the podium, his uniform crisp enough to cut paper, his expression somewhere between bored and annoyed. He clicked through a slideshow that outlined the upcoming training exercise, simulated close air support in the Nevada desert, working with Marine ground units to practice real-world coordination. Standard stuff, routine, except for the new pilot. Hayes paused on a slide showing squadron assignments and glanced toward the back of the room where Kira sat alone, her posture relaxed but her eyes absorbing every detail. "We've got a late addition to the rotation," Hayes said, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "Lieutenant Commander Volkov will be flying as Reaper 2-1. She's transitioning from a different career field, so let's make sure she doesn't get lost out there." A few chuckles rippled through the room. Kira didn't react. She'd heard worse in Kandahar, in Mogadishu, and places that didn't have names on maps. Hayes continued, detailing altitudes, frequencies, and rules of engagement. The mission was simple: four-ship formation, staggered approach, provide covering fire for a simulated infantry advance. The enemy would be played by aggressor squadrons flying adversary tactics. It was meant to be challenging but controlled. A test of coordination, not survival. What Hayes didn't mention was the whisper campaign already spreading through the squadron. The older woman who thought she could just walk into naval aviation, the diversity hire, the political statement. The rumors were creative and cruel, the kind of casual toxicity that thrived in competitive environments. Kira heard them all. She'd known she would. After the briefing, she walked to the hangar where her assigned aircraft waited. The FA-18E Super Hornet sat under harsh halogen lights, its gray skin painted with low-visibility markings, its twin engines promising 44,000 pounds of thrust. It was beautiful in the way that weapons were beautiful, functional, lethal, elegant in its simplicity. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the cool metal beneath her palm. This was different from the work she'd done before. No suppressed weapons in the dark. No close-quarters combat in mud-brick compounds. This was speed and altitude and physics, but the principle was the same: control the chaos, execute the mission, survive. Her crew chief, a salty master chief named Ortega with 26 years in the Navy, approached with a tablet. He'd heard the stories too, but something in the way Kira inspected the aircraft made him reconsider his assumptions. She wasn't checking boxes, she was hunting for problems. "You need anything, Commander?" Ortega asked, his tone neutral. Kira glanced at him. "Aircraft status. Green across the board, she's ready to fly." Kira nodded and continued her walk around, checking control surfaces, landing gear, weapons pylons. Ortega watched her work with growing interest. Most pilots trusted their crew chiefs and skipped the detailed inspection. This one didn't. This one moved like someone who understood that assumptions killed people. When she finished, she turned to Ortega. "Thank you, Master Chief. She's in good hands." It was a small acknowledgement, but Ortega heard the respect in it. He'd been doing this job since before she was in the Navy, and she recognized that. He nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Good hunting out there, ma'am." Kira climbed the ladder into the cockpit, settled into the ejection seat, and began her pre-flight checks. The instruments glowed in the dim light, displaying fuel quantities, weapon status, navigation data. She strapped in, connected her harness, plugged in her communication systems. The helmet fit perfectly, the oxygen mask sealed against her face. Outside, the ground crew prepared for engine start. The world narrowed to switches and procedures, muscle memory taking over. She'd flown hundreds of hours in simulators, passed every qualification with scores that raised eyebrows, but this was different. This was real metal and real sky and real people watching to see if she'd fail. The left engine spooled to life with a rising whine, then the right. The cockpit vibrated with controlled power. Kira ran through her checklist with mechanical precision, her voice calm on the radio as she contacted ground control. "Oceana ground, Reaper 2-1, ready for taxi." The controller's voice crackled back. "Reaper 2-1, Oceana ground, taxi to runway 23 via taxiway Alpha." "Taxi runway 23 via Alpha, Reaper 2-1." She released the brakes and guided the Super Hornet forward, the massive jet rolling smoothly across the concrete. Ahead, 3 other aircraft from her flight were already in position. The morning sun was just breaking the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Kira felt the familiar pre-mission calm settle over her. This was the moment before the storm, the breath before the plunge. Everything else fell away, the mockery, the doubts, the weight of expectation. There was only the mission, only the sky. The takeoff was glass smooth, the Super Hornet leaping off the runway with the kind of eager power that made every pilot fall in love with flying. Kira felt the acceleration press her back into the seat, watched the altimeter climb, felt the landing gear thump into their wells. She banked east, following the flight lead, her wingman tucking in behind her in a loose formation. The radio chatter was professional but laced with the casual arrogance of experienced aviators. These pilots had been flying combat missions for years, some with multiple deployments to carrier strike groups. They had call signs that told stories: Razor, Tombstone, Viper. They had swagger earned through repetition and survival, and they had no idea who Phantom was. The flight to Nevada took 3 hours with 1 aerial refueling. Kira slid her jet beneath the KC-135 tanker with practiced ease, extending her refueling probe into the drogue basket on the first attempt. The boom operator's voice came through her headset with grudging approval. "Good plug, Reaper 2-1. Thank you." No wasted words. No showboating, just professional competence. When they arrived over the Nelly's Range complex, the desert stretched out below like a rumpled tan blanket dotted with scrub brush and rocky outcroppings. The simulated battlefield was marked with smoke grenades and vehicle hulks, the enemy positions identified by coordinates fed into her tactical display. Commander Hayes's voice came through on the tactical frequency. "Reaper flight, push red on tactical 7. Picture clean, weapons free on designated targets only. Stay sharp." The 4 Super Hornets split into pairs, Kira flying wing to a hotshot lieutenant commander named Garrett with the Coulson blade. He was good, everyone knew it, especially him. He'd shot down 2 enemy fighters in Syria and had the mission patches to prove it. As they set up for their attack run, Blade's voice crackled through. "Reaper 2-1, stay high and tight. I'll make the first pass, you clean up anything I miss." There was condescension in the instruction, the assumption that she'd need him to show her how it was done. Kira didn't argue. She maintained position, watching Blade roll in on the target area, his jet diving toward the simulated enemy armor with textbook precision. He pickled off 2 training bombs that landed within meters of the designated coordinates. "Shack," the ground controller called. "Direct hits." Blade pulled up hard, banking away in a victory roll that was absolutely unnecessary but entirely in character. "That's how it's done, 2-1. Your turn." Kira didn't respond. She was already analyzing the battlefield, her eyes scanning the terrain for the secondary targets marked in her briefing packet. The enemy wasn't stupid. They'd dispersed their assets, hidden vehicles in wadis and behind rocky ridges. She rolled into her attack run, dropping altitude with controlled aggression, her thumb hovering over the weapon release. The targeting pod slaved to her helmet display, tracking the coordinates. She pickled twice, felt the aircraft lurch as the training weapons released, then pulled up in a smooth arc that subjected her body to 6 gravities of force. The G-suit inflated, squeezing her legs and abdomen to keep blood in her brain. The world grayed at the edges but never went dark. "Shack, shack," the ground controller called. "Reaper 2-1, both weapons on target." Blade's voice came back with less enthusiasm. "Nice shooting." They cycled through 3 more attack runs, each one increasing in complexity. The aggressor squadron joined the exercise, their F-16s playing the role of enemy air support. The sky became a chessboard, jets maneuvering for position, radar systems painting targets, missiles simulated through electronic warfare systems. Kira flew with economy of motion, never wasting energy, never taking unnecessary risks. She wasn't trying to be the best pilot in the sky. She was trying to complete the mission without getting killed. It was a different mindset than the others brought to the fight, and it showed. When an aggressor F-16 dove on Blade's 6 o'clock, Blade called for help with the kind of panic that came from suddenly being defensive. 2-1, break right, bandit on my 6. Kira was already moving. She'd seen the threat developing 30 seconds earlier, had positioned herself for the counter. She snapped her jet through a brutal turn, pulling the Super Hornet to the edge of its performance envelope, and slid into position behind the aggressor. In a real fight, she would have fired. In this exercise, the electronic systems recorded a simulated kill. "Splash 1, the exercise controller called. "Bandit down." The aggressor pilot's voice came through with professional respect. "Good kill, Reaper 2-1. Blade said nothing. They continued the exercise for another 90 minutes, cycling through scenarios that tested their ability to adapt and coordinate. By the end, Kira had logged 3 simulated air-to-air kills and 7 perfect weapons deliveries. The numbers didn't lie, but numbers were easy to dismiss. Statistics could be luck. What couldn't be dismissed was the way she flew, calm, precise, always thinking 3 moves ahead. After they landed back at Oceana, the debrief was held in the same briefing room where the day had started. Commander Hayes stood at the podium, reviewing gun camera footage and performance data. He paused on a clip showing Kira's defensive maneuver to save Blade. "Textbook awareness," Hayes said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Curiosity, maybe, or the first hint of respect. Blade sat in the front row, his jaw tight. Being saved by the new pilot, the older woman, the supposed diversity hire, it stung his pride in ways he wasn't ready to acknowledge. But he wasn't stupid. He'd seen the footage. He knew what could have happened if she hadn't been there. After the debrief, the squadron filed out into the humid Virginia evening. Kira walked alone toward her car, her flight bag slung over one shoulder. She wasn't looking for camaraderie. She knew it would come or it wouldn't, and either way, she had a mission to fly tomorrow. Behind her, Ortega watched from the hangar entrance. He'd seen the gun camera footage too. He'd been working with aviators for 2.5 decades, and he knew the difference between competence and talent. This one had both. He made a mental note to check her aircraft personally before every flight. Phantom didn't know it yet, but she just earned her first ally. The sky above Oceana was darkening to indigo, stars beginning to emerge through the humidity. Kira looked up briefly, then climbed into her car and drove away. Tomorrow would bring another mission, another chance to prove what she already knew, that she belonged here, that she'd earned this. The next morning brought low clouds and scattered rain, the kind of weather that made flying miserable but necessary. Naval aviators didn't get to choose their conditions. Combat happened in storms and darkness and chaos. So the training did too. Kira arrived at the squadron spaces before dawn, running through mission briefs and weather updates in the silent ready room. The deployment schedule had been updated overnight. The squadron was assigned to Carrier Air Wing 7 aboard the USS George H.W. Bush, with a departure date 6 weeks away. It was sooner than expected, a response to increasing tensions in the eastern Mediterranean. The brief didn't specify details, but the implications were clear. This wasn't going to be another peacetime cruise. Commander Hayes entered the ready room with his usual efficiency, his boots clicking on the tile floor. Carried a coffee cup that looked like it had been welded to his hand over years of early mornings. He noticed Kira at the computer terminal and paused. Volkov, a word. She stood and followed him to his office, a cramped space dominated by a metal desk and walls covered with photographs of aircraft and deployments. Hayes closed the door and gestured for her to sit. She remained standing. "I watched your footage from yesterday," Hayes said, settling into his chair. "Multiple times." Kira waited. She'd learned long ago that silence was more effective than defensiveness. "You flew well," Hayes continued. "Better than well. You flew like someone with combat experience, but your record shows you transitioned from another designator. Where'd you learn to fight like that?" This was the moment Kira had been preparing for since she'd submitted her application to flight school. The truth was classified at levels that most aviators would never access. Her service record showed a transfer from intelligence operations, a vague designation that could mean anything from briefing analysis to field work. What it didn't show were the missions, the insertions, the kills. "I had good instructors," Kira said evenly. Hayes studied her with the kind of attention that came from years of reading people in high-stakes situations. He'd commanded squadrons in Iraq and Afghanistan, had made split-second decisions that saved lives or ended them. He knew when someone was telling the truth and when they were managing information. "Your flight scores are exceptional," Hayes said. "Top 5% across the board. Your tactical judgment is even better, but the other pilots don't trust you yet. You know why?" "Because I'm old, female, and they think I'm a political statement," Kira said without emotion. Hayes almost smiled. "That's part of it. The other part is they don't know your story. They don't know what you've done or why you're here, and that makes them nervous. Should I hold a press conference, sir?" Now Hayes did smile, a brief flash of amusement. "No, but understand that trust in a squadron is earned through shared risk. They need to see you in situations where the stakes are real, where failure has consequences beyond a bad debrief." "I understand." "Good, because I'm putting you on the forward deployment. You'll be flying combat missions within 2 months of joining this squadron, which is highly irregular. But the timing doesn't care about regulations, and neither do our adversaries." Hayes paused, then added, "Don't make me regret this." Kira met his eyes. "I won't, sir." She left his office and returned to the ready room where other pilots were beginning to arrive for the day's briefings. The conversation died when she entered, then resumed at a lower volume. She'd become the subject they discussed when she wasn't around, the mystery they couldn't solve. Blade walked in with two other pilots, his flight suit unzipped to the waist, his confidence restored after a night's sleep. He saw Kira and diverted toward her. "Heard you're on the deployment roster," he said. "That's right. First time on a carrier." "Yes," he nodded slowly, processing this. "It's different than shore-based flying, smaller margin for error, especially at night." "I appreciate the heads up," Kira said, her tone neutral. Blade searched her expression for sarcasm but found none. It disarmed him slightly. He'd been expecting defensiveness or false bravado, the usual responses from new pilots trying to prove themselves. Instead, she just acknowledged the information and waited for him to continue or leave. "Look," Blade said, lowering his voice. "What you did yesterday, that defensive move, that was solid, really solid. I should have seen that bandit sooner." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was the closest thing to vulnerability Blade had shown since she'd arrived. Kira understood the gesture for what it was. "We're a flight," she said. "That's the job." Blade nodded and walked away, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. It was a small moment, but Ortega, who'd been watching from the doorway, recognized its significance. The squadron was beginning to shift, moving from skepticism towards something that might eventually become respect. But respect in a fighter squadron wasn't given. It was extracted through performance under pressure, through shared danger, through the kind of crucible that burned away pretense and left only capability. Kira knew that crucible was coming. The Mediterranean wasn't Nevada. The threats wouldn't be simulated, and when the shooting started, every assumption about who she was and what she could do would be tested against the ultimate metric: survival. She returned to her terminal and pulled up the carrier qualification syllabus. Landing a 30-ton aircraft on a moving ship in the dark was one of the most demanding tasks in aviation. The carrier deck would be pitching in the waves. The landing area would be lit by a few lights and a Fresnel lens optical system, and she'd have one chance to get it right. Too high and she'd bolt her, missing all the arresting wires and having to go around. Too low and she'd hit the back of the ship. The margin for error was measured in feet and fractions of seconds. Kira began memorizing the procedures, the radio calls, the lineup corrections. She'd learned long ago that preparation was the only insurance against chaos. You couldn't control the enemy, the weather, or the equipment failures, but you could control your own readiness. Outside, the rain intensified, water streaming down the windows. The sound was rhythmic and oddly calming. Kira worked through the syllabus until the morning brief, absorbing every detail, building the muscle memory that would matter when her brain was saturated with adrenaline and fatigue. The weeks before deployment compressed into a blur of qualifications, certifications, and endless briefings. Kira flew every day, sometimes twice, logging hours in the Super Hornet and proving her capability in scenario after scenario. The carrier qualifications came during a brief window when the USS George H.W. Bush was conducting training operations off the Virginia coast. The ship was a floating city, over 1,000 feet long and carrying more than 5,000 personnel. Its flight deck was a controlled chaos of jets, helicopters, and organized violence. Kira's first arrested landing happened at twilight, the sky fading from blue to black, the ocean below merging with the horizon in a disorienting void. She flew the Fresnel lens system that provided visual guidance with total concentration, making tiny corrections to keep the amber meatball centered between the green datum lights. "Reaper 2-1, call the ball," the landing signal officer's voice crackled. 2-1, Super Hornet ball 5.2, Kira responded, confirming her aircraft type, visual acquisition of the landing system, and fuel state. "Roger ball," the LSO acknowledged. The Super Hornet descended toward the deck, the ship growing larger in her windscreen with terrifying speed. She fought the instinct to pull up, trusting her training and the LSO's guidance. At the last second, she added a touch of power, felt the wheels slam onto the deck, then the violent deceleration as the arresting wire caught the tailhook. The jet went from 140 knots to 0 in 2 seconds. Her body strained against the harness, but she was down. Safe. The yellow-shirted deck crew signaled her to raise the hook and taxi clear. Kira followed their directions, her heart rate already settling back to normal. One trap down. 49 more to go before she was fully carrier qualified. Over the next 3 days, she flew day and night qualifications, landing in conditions that ranged from clear skies to driving rain. Each trap was graded by the LSO, the scores measuring her lineup, glide slope, and angle of attack. By the end of the qualification period, her average score placed her in the top quartile of the squadron. Blade, who'd been watching the scores with competitive interest, found her in the ready room after her final night trap. "You're making the rest of us look bad," he said, but there was no malice in it, just the acknowledgement of a competitor who'd proven worthy of respect. "Just trying to keep up," Kira replied. "Bullshit," Blade said with a grin. "You're a natural, or you've done this before and you're not telling us." Kira allowed herself a small smile. "Good instructors." Blade laughed and walked away. The dynamic was shifting. She was no longer the outsider, the unknown quantity. She was becoming part of the tribe, accepted not because of politics or quotas, but because she'd proven herself in the only language the squadron understood: performance under pressure. But there were still those who resented her presence. A few older officers saw her success as a threat to the natural order, a challenge to the unspoken rule that women didn't belong in certain roles. They didn't say it openly, regulations prohibited that kind of honesty, but it showed in the small ways. The briefings where her input was ignored, the flight schedules that paired her with the least experienced pilots, the casual comments about diversity initiatives and lowered standards. Kira absorbed it all without reaction. She'd faced worse in the SEALs, where the physical standards and cultural resistance were even more intense. She'd learned to let the noise wash over her, to focus on the mission and let results speak. But she also knew that silence could be mistaken for weakness. One evening in the officers' club, after a long day of training flights, a senior lieutenant commander named Bracken made a comment loud enough for her to hear. He was drunk, his words slurred, his inhibitions dissolved by whiskey. "They're so desperate for good press they'll put anyone in a cockpit now," Bracken said to his friends. "Next thing you know, they'll be running recruitment ads with her face on them. Join the Navy, where standards are optional." The conversation around the bar died. Everyone turned to see how Kira would respond. She was sitting alone at a corner table, reviewing flight manuals, a glass of water untouched beside her. She looked up slowly, her gaze settling on Bracken with the kind of cold attention that made survival instincts scream warnings. "Lieutenant Commander Bracken," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "I've read your flight scores. They're adequate, which is remarkable considering how much time you spend talking about other people instead of improving your own performance." Bracken's face flushed red. His friends suddenly found their drinks fascinating. "You've got something to say to me, say it to my face," Bracken shot back, standing with the unsteady aggression of drunk courage. Kira stood as well, but she didn't approach. She didn't need to. "I already did, and if you think standards are optional, feel free to request a one-on-one training exercise. We can see who meets them." The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Bracken wanted to escalate, wanted to turn this into a confrontation that would let him reclaim his pride. But he was drunk and she was sober, and everyone in the room knew how that would end. Commander Hayes, who'd been watching from the other side of the bar, intervened. "Bracken, you're done for the night. Get a ride home." Bracken glared at Kira but didn't argue with his commanding officer. He stumbled toward the exit, his friends following to make sure he didn't do anything else stupid. The room slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but something had changed. The pilots had seen Kira respond to provocation not with emotion but with precision. She'd offered a challenge based on merit, not outrage. It was a move that resonated with the fighter-pilot culture where swagger was respected but only when backed by capability. Hayes approached her table. "You didn't have to engage." "Yes, sir, I did," Kira said. "Silence gets interpreted as weakness. I needed to establish boundaries." Hayes considered this, then nodded. "Fair enough, but be careful. Bracken's got friends in places that matter." "So do I," Kira said quietly. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" Kira didn't answer, but her expression said everything. She had allies, even if they weren't visible. People who'd watched her operate in other contexts, who understood what she was capable of, who would ensure she got fair treatment even when the system tried to undermine her. Hayes filed that information away. There was more to Volkov's story than her service record suggested, and he was beginning to understand that pushing too hard for details might reveal things he wasn't cleared to know. "Get some rest," Hayes said. "Deployment starts in 2 weeks." Kira nodded and returned to her manuals. She had carrier procedures to memorize, weapons systems to master, and a deployment that would test everything she'd learned. The confrontation with Bracken was already fading into background noise. It didn't matter. What mattered was the mission. What mattered was proving to herself and to everyone watching that Phantom belonged in the sky. Outside, the Virginia night was warm and humid, filled with the sound of cicadas and distant jet engines. The carrier was waiting. The Mediterranean was waiting. And somewhere in the dark spaces between nations and ideologies, the next conflict was already taking shape. Kira would be ready. She'd been preparing for this her entire life, through mud and blood and missions that would never be acknowledged. Flying was just another battlefield, and battlefields were where Phantom thrived. She stayed in the officers' club until midnight, long after everyone else had left, reading through tactical publications and drinking water. When she finally drove back to her quarters, the base was quiet, the runways empty. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind running through procedures and contingencies, playing out scenarios until sleep finally came. Tomorrow would bring another set of qualifications, another chance to prove her worth. And the day after that, and the day after that. Until deployment, until combat, until the moment when all the training and testing would be exchanged for live ammunition and real consequences. Kira closed her eyes and let the darkness take her, knowing that sleep was just another form of preparation. Rest now, fight later. It was the rhythm she'd lived by for 20 years. It would carry her through whatever came next. The USS George H.W. Bush departed Naval Station Norfolk on a gray October morning, the massive carrier sliding away from the pier with the kind of inevitable momentum that characterized all departures to war. Kira stood on the flight deck in her float coat and cranial helmet, watching the Virginia coastline recede into mist. Around her, the organized chaos of a carrier flight deck unfolded, jets being positioned, ordnance being loaded, aircraft directors guiding pilots with precise hand signals that looked like dance moves. The air wing consisted of 44 aircraft, 4 squadrons of FA-18 Super Hornets, 1 squadron of EA-18G Growlers for electronic warfare, a detachment of E-2D Hawkeyes for airborne early warning, and the obligatory helicopters for search and rescue. Nearly 3,000 aviation personnel supported the operation, working in 12-hour shifts that blurred days into continuous cycles of launch and recovery. Commander Hayes gathered the squadron in the ready room for the first official brief of the deployment. Maps of the Mediterranean covered the bulkheads, marked with zones of interest: Syria, Libya, contested waters near Cyprus. The geopolitical situation had deteriorated over the past month. Russian forces were conducting aggressive patrols, testing NATO response times. Iranian-backed militias were threatening shipping lanes. And somewhere in the mix, terrorist networks continued planning attacks that would justify the carrier's presence. "Our mission is to maintain stability and provide rapid response capability," Hayes explained, his laser pointer tracing routes across the map. "That means combat air patrols, close air support for coalition forces, and strike packages on high-value targets as they develop. We'll be operating in a contested environment with multiple actors, some hostile, some neutral, all unpredictable." He paused to let that sink in. "This is not a training exercise. The weapons are live, the threats are real, and if you make mistakes, people die, possibly you." The room was silent. These were experienced pilots, but deployment always brought a sobering clarity. The comfortable distance of peacetime evaporated. Now they were the tip of the spear, the instrument of national policy, the people who would execute violence on behalf of distant politicians and uncertain objectives. "Flight assignments are posted," Hayes continued. We'll start with defensive counter-air patrols while the ship transits to station. Once we're on location, expect the tempo to increase. Questions? Blade raised his hand. Rules of engagement. Weapons hold unless threatened or cleared by higher authority, but threat assessment is yours to make in the moment. If you believe you're in danger, you are authorized to defend yourself. We'll sort out the paperwork later. It was the kind of answer that gave pilots flexibility while maintaining plausible deniability for the command structure. In practice, it meant that split-second decisions would be judged by people in comfortable offices thousands of miles away, long after the bullets had stopped flying. Kira studied the maps, memorizing geographic features, calculating distances and fuel requirements. The Mediterranean was smaller than the Pacific but infinitely more complicated, a dense network of competing interests and historical grudges compressed into an area where mistakes could spark regional wars. After the brief, she headed to the spaces where her aircraft was being prepped for the first patrol. The Super Hornet looked different on the carrier deck than it had on the spacious tarmac at Oceana. Here it was surrounded by other jets, each one armed and fueled, packed together with barely enough room to walk between them. The weapons loadout for the patrol was standard: 2 AIM-120 AMRAAMs for beyond visual range engagements, 2 AIM-9 Sidewinders for close-in dogfighting, and a full magazine for the M61 cannon. She wouldn't be carrying bombs today. This was air superiority work, ensuring the skis remained clear of threats. Ortega appeared beside her, tablet in hand. He'd volunteered for the deployment specifically to work with Kira, a fact that had surprised her when she'd learned of it. "All green," Ortega reported. "She's ready to kill whatever you point her at." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Kira said. "Hope's got nothing to do with it, ma'am. We go where we're sent." Kira nodded. Ortega understood the fundamental truth of military service. You didn't get to choose your wars, only how you fought them. She climbed into the cockpit and began her pre-flight checks, the familiar ritual calming her nerves. Below deck, the catapult crews were preparing for launch. The process was controlled violence, a shuttle attached to the aircraft's nose gear, steam pressure building in the system. Everything calibrated to accelerate 30 tons of metal and fuel and weapons from 0 to 165 miles per hour in 2 seconds. When her turn came, Kira taxied into position, felt the shuttle attach with a solid clunk, and ran her engines up to full military power. The jet strained against the holdback bar, every system screaming to be released. The catapult officer checked his board, confirmed green lights, then dropped to one knee and pointed down the deck. Launch. The acceleration was always shocking, even when you knew it was coming. Kira's body was crushed back into the seat, her vision narrowing as the G-forces peaked, and then she was airborne, the carrier falling away behind her, nothing but blue water and empty sky ahead. "Reaper 2-1 airborne," she called. "Roger, 2-1, the air controller responded. "Continue on assigned heading, Marshal at Angels 20. She climbed to 20,000 feet and rendezvoused with the other 3 aircraft in her division. They formed a combat spread, 2 pairs separated by several miles, scanning the sky with radar and eyeballs. The patrol was supposed to be routine. 4 hours of flying an oval pattern, watching for aircraft that might approach the carrier strike group, deterring aggression through presence. But on the second hour, the radar picture changed. Reaper flight, bogey group bearing 045, 60 miles, track north, medium altitude, the E-2 Hawkeye controller called. The Hawkeye was an airborne command post, its massive radar dome tracking everything in a 200-mile radius. Reaper 1-1 confirmed 2 contacts, designate hostile. Hayes's voice responded from the lead aircraft. Reaper, contacts are squawking civilian transponders but following a flight profile inconsistent with commercial traffic. Treat as unknown, maintain weapons hold but prepare for intercept. The 4 Super Hornets adjusted course, accelerating toward the contacts. Kira's radar picked them up at 40 miles to aircraft, flying in close formation, heading directly toward the carrier. "Reaper 2-1 has contact," she called. "Merge track 2 contacts." "Roger 2-1. Reaper flight is cleared to close for visual identification. Stay tight." They descended slightly, trading altitude for speed, and closed the distance. At 10 miles, Kira could see them on her targeting pod, two Su-35 flankers, Russian-built air superiority fighters painted in Syrian Air Force colors but almost certainly flown by Russian pilots. The flankers were beautiful aircraft, twin-engine beasts with thrust vectoring and modern avionics. They were also a direct challenge. Flying toward a U.S. carrier strike group wasn't an accident. It was a probe, a test to see how the Americans would respond. Reaper 11 has visual two flankers Syrian markings, Hayes called, switching to guard frequency. He changed to the international emergency channel that all aircraft monitored. Syrian aircraft heading 270 at flight level 280, you are approaching a United States carrier strike group. Alter course immediately or you will be intercepted. There was no response. The flankers continued their approach. Reaper flight close to within 5 miles and establish escort positions, Hayes ordered. Do not fire unless fired upon. The 4 Super Hornets split into pairs, Kira and Blade forming the second element. They accelerated to intercept, their jets cutting through the thin air at over 500 knots. At 3 miles, the flankers broke formation. One turned left, one turned right, and suddenly the engagement geometry became complicated. They were trying to split the American formation, forcing the Super Hornets to divide their attention. Hayes stayed with the left-hand flanker. Kira followed the right. 2-1 is engaged right, she called, her voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The flanker pilot was good. He rolled inverted and pulled, diving toward the wave tops before leveling out at 500 feet above the water. Kira followed, matching his maneuver, staying glued to his 6 o'clock position. The flanker tried a series of aggressive brakes, turning hard enough to force Kira to pull 6, then 7 GS. The world grayed at the edges, her G-suit squeezing, her breathing controlled. She'd done this before, maybe not in a Super Hornet, but in other contexts where staying on target was the difference between mission success and failure. The flanker couldn't shake her. After 2 minutes of hard maneuvering, the Russian pilot seemed to accept that he was outmatched. He leveled his wings and turned away from the carrier, climbing back to altitude. Kira stayed with him for another 20 miles, then broke off as ordered. Reaper 2-1 terminated intercept, Bandit heading away. Good job, 2-1, Hayes called. Reaper flight returned to station. They climbed back to patrol altitude, the adrenaline slowly fatting. Blade's voice came through on their private frequency. That was some flying, 2-1. You stayed with him through the whole scissors. He was good, Kira replied, but predictable. He ran a textbook Russian defensive pattern. Once I recognized it, I knew where he'd go next. There was silence on the radio, then Blade laughed. Where the hell did you learn Russian air combat tactics? Kira didn't answer. After a moment, Blade laughed again. Right, good instructors. When they landed back on the carrier, the LSO gave Kira an OK pass-centered ball, proper lineup, perfect deceleration. She taxied clear and shut down the engines, her hands still steady despite 4 hours in the cockpit and the close intercept with a hostile fighter. Ortega was waiting as she climbed down from the aircraft. Heard you had some excitement up there. Just a training opportunity, Kira said, but Ortega had been listening to the radio chatter. He'd heard the calm in her voice during the engagement, the precision of her calls. He'd worked with enough pilots to know when someone was operating on instinct versus training. This pilot had both. You did good, Commander, Ortega said. Kira nodded her thanks and headed below deck. The ready room was buzzing with conversation about the intercept. The squadron had just faced its first real test of the deployment, and they'd handled it without firing a shot. But everyone knew it was just the beginning. The next 3 weeks established a rhythm of patrols and alerts, brief periods of intense activity separated by long hours of waiting. The carrier operated around the clock, launching and recovering aircraft in an endless cycle that never quite synced with human circadian rhythms. Kira flew every other day, logging hours over the Mediterranean, Syria, Lebanon, watching the ground war unfold from 20,000 feet where the violence looked almost abstract. But the abstraction ended when the call came for close air support. A special operations team was pinned down in eastern Syria, surrounded by hostile forces, taking casualties. They needed immediate air support or they would be overrun. Kira was on ready alert when the scramble order came through. She ran to her aircraft, already loaded with precision-guided munitions and a full combat loadout. Blade was her wingman, both of them launching within 3 minutes of the alert. The catapult shot them into a twilight sky, the sun setting behind them, darkness creeping across the desert ahead. Reaper 2-1, contact Hammer on Tactical 9 for mission details, the carrier controller called. Kira switched frequencies and checked in with the ground controller, a forward air controller embedded with the special operations team. His call sign was Hammer 26, and his voice was tight with stress. Reaper Flight, Hammer 26. We are danger close with enemy forces at multiple positions. Friendlies are marked with IR strobes, but we are taking heavy fire from a technical mounted with a 50 cal at grid November Delta 473219. Request immediate suppression. Kira pulled up the grid coordinates on her tactical display and slaved her targeting pod to the location. The image resolved in her helmet display a Toyota pickup truck with a heavy machine gun mounted in the bed, positioned behind a low wall, firing toward a building where the American forces were trapped. Hammer, Reaper 2-1 has visual on target. Confirm no friendlies within 50 meters of that position. Negative, friendlies are 70 meters south in the 2-story structure. You are cleared hot. Kira rolled in, diving toward the target, her targeting reticle tracking the truck. At the last moment, the gunner saw her coming and tried to swing the machine gun skyward. Too late. She pickled a GBU-12 laser-guided bomb and pulled off hard, climbing away as the weapon tracked to target. The explosion was visible even from altitude, a flash of light and debris that silenced the gun. Hammer, target destroyed, Kira called. Reaper, good hits, but we've got more contacts. Stand by for additional targets. For the next 40 minutes, Kira and Blade worked the battlefield, dropping precision weapons on enemy positions, strafing vehicles with their cannons, providing the cover the ground team needed to break contact and extract. It was exhausting work, each attack run requiring total concentration, the margin for error measured in meters when friendly forces were so close. When the team finally reported they were clear and moving to the extraction point, Hammer's voice came through with audible relief. Reaper Flight Hammer 26, you just saved our asses. We owe you a beer when we get back to civilization. Just doing the job, Hammer. Glad you're safe. Kira and Blade climbed back to altitude and headed for the carrier. The flight back was quiet, both pilots processing what they'd just done. They dropped live weapons on human beings, ended lives in the service of saving others. It was the fundamental transaction of combat, the algebra of violence that reduced complex moral questions to simple arithmetic. When they trapped back on the carrier, the deck was dark except for the faint glow of red lights in the Fresnel lens. Kira's landing was harder than usual, the fatigue showing in her control inputs. The LSO noted it but didn't say anything. Combat missions wore on people differently than training flights. The debrief was short. Hayes reviewed the gun camera footage, confirmed the kills were righteous, and filed the reports that would justify the weapon's expenditure. Then he looked at Kira. How you doing? Fine, sir. Bullshit. That was your first time dropping live ordnance on people. You don't have to be fine. Kira considered lying but decided against it. It needed to be done. I'd do it again. Hayes nodded. Good answer. Get some food and rack out. You're off the flight schedule tomorrow. Kira walked through the dim passageways of the carrier toward the officer's mess. She wasn't hungry, but she needed to eat. Fuel the body, maintain readiness. It was automatic. She ate alone, then returned to her stateroom, a tiny compartment she shared with another female officer who was currently on duty. She lay on her rack in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the ship. The ventilation systems humming, footsteps in the passageway, the distant thud of aircraft landing above. Her mind replayed the mission, analyzing each decision, each maneuver, the truck exploding, the enemy fighters scattering, the American voices calling thanks. She'd killed before in closer quarters with different tools, But there was something different about doing it from the sky, about the clean distance and the mathematical precision. It felt less personal and somehow more permanent. She thought about the men in that truck. They'd made choices that led them to that moment, the same way she had. They'd picked up guns and aimed them at Americans. They'd accepted the risks. The moral weight wasn't hers to carry alone. She closed her eyes and forced herself to sleep. Tomorrow would bring another mission, another set of decisions. The deployment was only beginning. Over the following weeks, the missions blurred together. Combat air patrols, close air support, reconnaissance flights. Kira flew them all with the same methodical competence, building a reputation as the pilot you wanted overhead when things went wrong. The squadron noticed. The casual dismissals stopped. The questions about her qualifications disappeared. Instead, she became the pilot others wanted on their wing, the one who stayed cool when the chaos peaked. Blade, in particular, had become something approaching a friend. They flew together frequently, developed the kind of wordless communication that came from shared risk. One night in the ready room, after a particularly tense mission where they'd narrowly avoided a surface-to-air missile, Blade asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Who the hell are you, really?" Kira looked up from the maintenance report she was reading. "What do you mean?" "I mean you fly like someone who's been doing this for 20 years, but you just got your wings. You know Russian tactics. You don't flinch when missiles are coming at you. And I've seen your medical records. You've got scars that don't come from flight school." The ready room had gone quiet. Other pilots were pretending not to listen while listening intently. Kira set down the report and considered how to answer. Truth was still classified. Her service record would remain sanitized until long after she retired, if ever. But these people were risking their lives alongside her. They deserved something. "Before I was a pilot, I did other work," she said carefully. "The kind that doesn't make it into official records. I can't talk about the details, and I wouldn't even if I could. But what I can tell you is that I've been in bad situations before, and I learned how to stay calm when everything's falling apart. That's all you need to know." Blade studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But for the record, I'm glad you're on our side." "So am I," Kira said with a slight smile. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted. The squadron now understood that Kira wasn't just competent, she was experienced in ways they couldn't fully comprehend. And that experience was an asset they could rely on. Commander Hayes, watching from his desk in the corner, allowed himself a small smile. His instinct about Volkov had been correct. She was exactly what the squadron needed, even if they didn't fully understand why. The deployment continued. The missions grew more complex, the threats more sophisticated. Russian fighters became more aggressive, probing American responses, testing resolve. Iranian proxies fired on coalition forces. The region teetered on the edge of larger conflict, held in check only by the measured application of force. And through it all, Phantom flew. Calm, precise, lethal when necessary. She'd stopped being the outsider. Now she was essential. The pilot you wanted overhead when the bullets started flying. The voice on the radio that meant help was coming. 3 months into the deployment, the Carrier Strike Group received intelligence about a high-value target, a terrorist logistics coordinator operating in Libya, someone responsible for funneling weapons and foreign fighters into Syria. The target was time-sensitive. He would be at a specific location for only a few hours before moving again. The mission required a precision strike at night, in contested airspace, with minimal collateral damage. Commander Hayes briefed the strike package personally. 2 Super Hornets would conduct the attack, one to deliver the weapon, one to provide support and suppression. The ingress route would take them through Syrian air defenses, including SA-22 surface-to-air missile systems capable of engaging aircraft at high altitude. Kira was selected to deliver the weapon. Blade would fly support. It was a vote of confidence and a recognition of her skills, but it was also dangerous. The mission had a high probability of surface-to-air engagement, and Libya at night was about as hostile as environments got. They launched 2 hours before midnight, the carrier deck illuminated by red lights that preserved night vision. The catapult shot felt more violent in darkness, the disorientation more complete. Kira climbed to altitude and turned toward the coast, her radar warning receiver scanning for threats. The flight to the target took an hour, most of it over water. They crossed the coastline at low altitude, using terrain masking to avoid radar detection, then climbed to weapons release altitude 15 miles from the target. Reaper 2-1, target in sight, Kira called, her targeting pod locked on the building where the coordinator was meeting with his lieutenants. Confirm authorization to engage. Reaper, higher authority confirms weapons free. You are cleared hot. Kira rolled in, tracking the target with her laser designator, and released a GBU-54 precision-guided bomb. The weapon fell away cleanly, guiding toward the building with GPS and laser accuracy. She pulled off target and watched the impact through her pod. The building disintegrated in a flash of light and pressure. Secondary explosions suggested ammunition or explosives had been stored inside. Target destroyed, she reported. Reaper, good hit. Egress on planned route. Be advised, multiple SAM systems are active in your area. The radar warning receiver immediately lit up multiple search radars painting her aircraft. Somewhere below, Syrian air defense crews were tracking her jet, calculating intercept solutions, preparing to fire. 2-1 is spiked, Kira called, meaning a fire control radar had locked onto her aircraft. Defending. She threw the Super Hornet into a defensive turn, dispensing chaff and flares to confuse the incoming missile. The radar warning receiver screamed, the audio tone indicating a missile had been launched. Blade's voice cut through the chaos. 2-1, break right, break right. Kira rolled hard, pulling maximum GS, her vision tunneling as blood drained from her brain. The missile passed within 100 feet, close enough that she could see its exhaust plume in the darkness. It detonated behind her, shrapnel pinging off her aircraft's skin but causing no critical damage. 2-1 status, Hayes called from the carrier. 2-1 is hit but flyable, continuing egress. Another missile launch, another defensive maneuver. This one was closer, the proximity fuse detonating near enough that the blast wave rocked the aircraft. Warning lights illuminated on her instrument panel, hydraulic pressure fluctuating, one engine showing elevated temperature. She was losing systems but still flying. 2-1, you've got a fuel leak, Blade called, his jet pulled in close to visually inspect her aircraft. It's bad. You're not going to make it back to the ship. Kira checked her fuel gauge. He was right. She was losing fuel at a rate that would leave her dry before she reached the carrier. Her options were limited: eject over hostile territory and become a prisoner, or try to find an alternative landing site. Reaper, 2-1 declaring an emergency. Request nearest divert field. The carrier controller came back with bad news. 2-1, closest friendly field is Sigonella in Sicily, but you don't have fuel to make it. Recommend immediate ejection while you're over water. SAR is being launched. Search and rescue. A helicopter would pluck her from the Mediterranean, assuming she survived the ejection and the sharks. It was the safe choice, the by-the-book response. But Kira had spent her career finding third options when the obvious choices were unacceptable. Negative, she said. 2-1 is attempting recovery on the boat. 2-1, you don't have enough fuel, the controller argued. You'll flame out before you reach the deck. Then I'll glide, Kira said. There was silence on the radio. What she was proposing was borderline suicidal. Landing a fighter jet on a carrier was hard enough with functioning engines. Doing it as a glider with no power at night with a damaged aircraft had been attempted exactly twice in naval aviation history. Neither attempt had ended well. Commander Hayes' voice cut through. Volkov, this is Hayes. I'm ordering you to eject. That's a direct order. Kira considered disobeying. She'd flown thousands of hours in her career, landed in worse conditions, survived situations that should have killed her. But she'd never violated a direct order from a commanding officer. There was a difference between bending rules and breaking them. Reaper 1121 copies, preparing to eject. She began the procedures, securing loose items, ensuring her survival gear was properly attached. But even as she went through the motions, her mind was calculating. Distance to carrier. Rate of fuel loss, glide ratio of the Super Hornet. There was a possibility, slim but real, that she could make it. Blade had been watching her fuel state. He knew what she was thinking. Don't do it, Kira, it's not worth the risk. It was the first time he'd used her first name. In that moment, she realized she'd earned more than respect. She'd earned the kind of relationship where someone would risk insubordination to save your life. "I know," she said quietly. Then she pulled the ejection handle. The canopy blew away with an explosive crack, and the rocket motor beneath her seat fired, launching her into the darkness at 14 gs of acceleration. The world spun violently. Then the drogue chute deployed, stabilizing her fall. Below, her Super Hornet continued flying for another mile before the engines flamed out and it plunged into the Mediterranean. Kira hung beneath the parachute canopy, watching the water rush up to meet her. She'd done night water landings in training, but this was different. This was cold water in the dark with rescue potentially hours away. She hit the surface hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. The parachute collapsed over her, threatening to drag her under. She fought against the shroud lines, inflated her life vest, and activated her personal locator beacon. Then she waited. The Mediterranean at night was vast and indifferent. Waves lifted and dropped her in a slow rhythm. The cold was already seeping into her bones despite the survival suit. She could see stars above when the waves allowed, brilliant and uncaring. This was the job. Sometimes you flew the mission and came home. Sometimes you didn't. An hour passed. Then two. Kira's body was shutting down, hypothermia claiming territory despite her training and will. Her thoughts became slow and thick. She thought about the missions she'd flown, the people she'd saved, the ones she'd killed. She thought about the squadron and whether they'd understand why she'd followed orders instead of trying to save the jet. She thought about Phantom, the call sign she'd earned in another life, and whether it would follow her to whatever came next. Then she heard it, the distant thump of rotor blades. A helicopter, searchlight scanning the water. The SAR crew had found her beacon. The light swept across the waves and locked onto her position. A rescue swimmer dropped from the helicopter, swam to her, and secured a lift harness around her chest. They were pulled up together, the helicopter's winch straining against the weight. Warm hands pulled her into the cabin, stripped off her wet gear, wrapped her in thermal blankets. "You're safe, Commander," the rescue swimmer said. "We've got you." Kira nodded, too cold to speak. She'd survived. The mission was complete. The target was dead. The aircraft was lost, but she was alive. By the metrics that mattered, it was a success. They flew her directly to the carrier. The flight deck crew had been watching the rescue on their radios, and when the helicopter landed, Commander Hayes was waiting. He helped her out of the aircraft, his face grim. "You followed orders," Hayes said. "It wasn't quite a question." "Yes, sir." "Good, because if you tried to land that damaged aircraft on my deck at night with no fuel, I would have court-martialed you." Kira smiled faintly. "Understood, sir." Hayes shook his head. "Get checked out by medical, then get some rack time. We'll debrief in the morning." Kira made her way to medical, where a corpsman confirmed she had mild hypothermia but no other injuries. They gave her warm fluids and monitoring for a few hours, then released her to her stateroom. She lay in her rack, wrapped in blankets, listening to the familiar sounds of the carrier. She'd lost an aircraft worth $70 million. She'd ejected into hostile waters. She'd survived. Tomorrow there would be reports and investigations and questions about whether the mission had been worth the cost. But tonight, she was alive and the target was dead and somewhere in Syria. American troops were safer because of the work she'd done. Phantom had flown again, and she'd come home. 2 days later, after the formal investigation concluded that she'd acted appropriately, and the aircraft loss was due to enemy action rather than pilot error, Commander Hayes called her to his office. "I got a message from the ground team you supported in Syria," Hayes said, turning his computer monitor so she could see the email. It was short and direct. "Reaper 2-1 saved our lives. Whatever happened after, she's a hero. Hammer 2-6. Hayes looked at her steadily. "That's 2 missions where you've put yourself at risk to complete the objective and protect American lives. I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The paperwork is already in motion." Kira blinked. The DFC was one of the highest awards for aviation valor, typically reserved for actions of extraordinary heroism. "Sir, I was just doing my job." "Your job doesn't include staying on target while surface-to-air missiles are actively engaging you. Your job doesn't include ejecting into hostile waters instead of trying to save a $70 million aircraft. You went above and beyond, Volkov. Twice. The medal is deserved." Kira didn't know what to say. In her previous career, medals had been classified, awarded in closed ceremonies that would never be publicized. This was different. This would be on her official record, visible to everyone. "Thank you, sir," she finally said. Hayes stood and extended his hand. "You've proven yourself, Commander. To me, to the squadron, to everyone who doubted whether you belonged here. I'm proud to have you in my command." They shook hands, and Kira left his office with something she hadn't felt in years: recognition. Not the quiet acknowledgement of covert operators, but public validation of her skills and sacrifice. The squadron's attitude had completely shifted. Where once there had been skepticism and resentment, now there was respect bordering on admiration. Blade treated her as an equal. The other pilots sought her advice, and even Bracken the drunk who'd challenged her in the officers' club had apologized in a brief, awkward conversation. The deployment continued for another 3 months, the missions blending into a continuous stream of patrols and strikes. Kira flew almost every other day, logging combat hours that most pilots wouldn't accumulate in an entire career. She became known throughout the carrier air wing as the pilot who'd survived the SAM engagement in Libya, who'd followed orders and ejected rather than risk the ship, who'd been pulled from the Mediterranean and returned to flying within 48 hours. When the USS George H.W. Bush finally turned west and headed back to Norfolk, the entire air wing gathered on the flight deck for a group photo. Kira stood in the back row, surrounded by her squadron mates, wearing her flight suit and a slight smile. The deployment was over. She'd survived. More than that, she'd thrived. The carrier docked at Norfolk on a cold February morning, families waiting on the pier with signs and flowers and tears. Kira had no one waiting. She'd long ago accepted that her life didn't include the normal rhythms of family and homecoming. But as she walked down the gangway, she saw a figure standing apart from the crowd. A man in civilian clothes, average height, unremarkable features, the kind of person who disappeared in crowds. He caught her eye and gave the slightest nod. Kira changed direction and walked toward him. When she was close enough for quiet conversation, he spoke. "Phantom." It wasn't a question. It was identification, confirmation that her past was still watching. "I don't use that call sign anymore," Kira said. "I know. But we wanted you to know that your work, both past and present, hasn't gone unnoticed. There are people who understand what you've accomplished, on both sides of your career. Is this official?" "Nothing about this conversation is official, but if you ever decide that flying isn't enough, that you miss the other work, there's always a place for someone with your skills." Kira studied him. He was agency, almost certainly. The kind of recruiter who tracked high-value personnel and made sure they stayed in play. "I'm happy where I am," she said. "I know, but circumstances change, wars end, new conflicts begin, and when they do, people like you become very valuable." He handed her a card with nothing but a phone number printed on it. No name, no agency identification, just 10 digits. "In case you change your mind." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of families and sailors. Kira looked at the card for a moment, then tucked it into her pocket. She wasn't ready to go back to that life, but she understood the game well enough to know that you didn't burn bridges with the intelligence community. You kept your options open. She collected her gear and headed to her car. Norfolk looked exactly the same as when she'd left, but she felt different. She deployed as an unknown quantity, a pilot with a mysterious background trying to prove herself. She was returning as a combat veteran with confirmed kills, a near-death experience, and a medal for valor in the works. The squadron was being given 30 days of leave before the next training cycle began. Kira had no specific plans, no family to visit, no vacation destinations calling to her. She would probably spend the time in Virginia Beach, running on the sand, studying for her next qualifications, preparing for whatever came next. But as she drove away from the naval base, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She'd done what she set out to do. She'd proven that Phantom could fly with the best of them, that age and gender meant nothing when bullets were flying and missions needed completing. The call sign was changing. She was Reaper now, at least officially. But somewhere in the classified files and in the memories of people who'd operated in the shadows, Phantom still existed. A reminder that Kira Volkov had lived multiple lives, each one demanding excellence, each one requiring her to prove herself against impossible standards. She'd met those standards, every time. The road stretched ahead, gray and ordinary. Behind her, the carrier was already preparing for its next deployment, the cycle continuing without pause. Kira drove toward whatever came next, knowing that she'd earned her place in the sky and knowing that if the shadows called again, she'd be ready. Because that's what Phantom did. She adapted, she survived, she excelled, and she never ever quit.